Today's luncheon is sponsored by Asian Studies along with the Department of Comparative Literature. Speaker today is Seth, Jacobowitz, Assistant Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature at Yale University, and John Abel, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Japanese, will be given your introduction for him shortly. And before turning things over to John, I'd like to announce the speaker this week. Our luncheon speaker for the next week will be Matt Rifkin, Professor in English at the University of North Carolina. He will give a talk on Among Ghost Dancers, Sarah Winnemucca, and the production on tribal identity. Now John will give an introduction for today's speaker.
Thanks. It gives me great pleasure to host Seth Jacobowitz here at Penn State. I've known Seth and his work since we met as graduate students at a conference, I don't know, over a decade ago now. And I remember at the time finding him a challenging interlocutor who was set to push the field in new ways. And it's the kind of thing that as a graduate student gets you very excited, but you wonder what's going to become of this person. And in that time, I think he's made good on that early promise. As a critic and a translator, his work has, in a brief period of time, touched on many and sundry genres in Japanese literature, ranging from detective fiction to horror fiction to science fiction. I've taught from his translations here many times and found his work inspiring. His first book is one of a series of recent books paying more and more attention to mediation and mediality in Japanese studies, titled Writing Technology in Meiji Japan, a Media History of Modern Japanese Literature and Visual Culture. It's a long overdue, historically grounded critique of the common theoretical musings of the field of modern Japanese literature, which were popular in the 1990s and early 2000s. And by placing literary and indeed national history within the context of cultural material in Meiji Japan, the book takes as its organizing principle the notion that writing as we know it was significantly transformed by the practices and media cultivated and developed through the late 19th century. Without arguing that such methods of visualization, inscription, transcription, circulation, and standardization determine writing as we know it, the book makes the more nuanced claim that to understand modern writing, and particularly modern literature, we must understand its indebtedness to such techniques and their history. It's a thoroughly convincing argument, and one that I think is going to have the field thinking for years simply because of its historical truths. But by shifting our attention from the overly and overtly aestheticized subsets to the entire array of writing writ large, writing technology brackets problems and issues that have hitherto been seen as narrow problems of literature or art history, and shows how they are related directly to major policies of modernization. The result is that the connections too often obscured by otherwise interesting scholarship between art movements like modernism, national and corporate technological movements like modernization, and world historical periods like modernity become very clear in this book. Here, modernity, modernization, and modernism converge into a clear picture. His next book project is titled Japanese Brazil, Immigrant Literature and Transnational Expansion. And this is a project that he's been working on for a number of years, and it seems like it's coming to a close pretty soon, I hope. But it's sent it's sent him to Brazil and to learn Portuguese, and which he's taken up in the last decade or so. So I'll turn things over to
Oh, great. All right. We are recording this, so I'm going to just turn on the mic. Thank you, John, for that warm introduction. Just just going to set up the PowerPoint. One moment, please. Okay. So yes, the material I'll be presenting today comes from the latest research from my book called Japanese Brazil, Immigrant Literature and Transnational Expansion. Very often professors will say that something is a work in progress, and this is not only a work in progress, but you're actually getting my research in progress. So these are things that I've been looking at between July, when I first found them in the library at Waseda University in Tokyo, and now. So I hope you'll find it more exciting than confusing, that some of these things are still, I'm still unteasing them. Beginning with the voyage of the Kasato Maru steamship in 1908, transoceanic passage brought nearly 200,000 immigrants from Japan to Brazil until the onset of World War II in 1941. This mass migration was welcomed and frequently subsidized by the Brazilian government to supply much-needed labor for the coffee boom in the interior of Sao Paulo state. For the Japanese authorities, it was seen as a means of reducing poverty and unrest from its so-called surplus population, in Japanese kajo jinko, while simultaneously increasing the Japanese people's presence overseas. The conventional portrait of the Japanese immigrant experience is one in which families left behind their homeland for a new paradise, or shinitenchi, of coffee plantations and abundant tropical farmland in Brazil. Yet in contrast to earlier waves of the Japanese diaspora to the Anglophone world, there were well-defined policies to keep immigrants to Brazil and elsewhere in South America, linguistically, culturally, and in some very specific ways nationalistically, within the fold of the empire, or we might say the folk of the empire. Even at the height of Japanese imperialism in the 1930s, when geographically and culturally more proximate destinations existed in Taiwan, Korea, China, and Manchuria, Brazil continued to draw tens of thousands of immigrants per year. The Japanese in Brazil were often geographically isolated in relatively homogeneous communities called in Portuguese colônias, or colonies. A newly imagined community, a new imagined community, in the sense that Edith Anderson outlines, quickly took root in the Japanese language immigrant newspapers that produced locally produced serialized fiction alongside news of the world, the Japanese Empire, and their adopted country. It is noteworthy that the immigrants consistently referred to their literary productions as shokumin bunge, or colonial literature, and vigorously debated its meaning. My first slide here shows you the 1932 inaugural prize from the Brasil Jiho, or in Portuguese, Notícias do Brasil, the News of Brazil newspaper that was almost entirely a Japanese language newspaper. And you see here listed the first, second, and third prize winners, and indeed it's called the colonial literature prize. I also want to add, the immigrants did not call themselves Nikkei, meaning people of Japanese descent. Rather, they called themselves Japanese. So Nihonjin or Hojin, which is a synonym, or they called themselves overseas brethren, Kaigai Doho. Moreover, following a precedent that began in Hokkaido and would become firmly established throughout the Japanese Empire, they saw themselves as colonists, again, shokunin, pioneers, kaitakusha, and settlers, nyushokusha. At the same time that this is happening in Brazil, a nascent category of popular literature emerged in pre-war Japan that extolled the lives of immigrants and so-called overseas brethren, first in the form of adventure stories, and later as Horatio Alger and Horace Greeley type success stories, so the immigrant made good. The earliest that I've been able to identify is in the January 1920 issue of the popular literary journal Shinseinen, or New Youth, with a story that is categorized as a strange tale of adventure. It's right here in the middle of the, on the right-hand side. And the title of the story is The Mixed-Race Child of the South Seas Islands, Nanyoto no Konketsu. Although stories of this kind spanned from Northeast Asia, where the Japanese Empire had already established its presence, to the South Seas region, where it had an eye towards doing so, none was more prominently or more frequently represented than Brazil. In pro-expansionist journals with titles such as Brasil, or Brazil, Kaigai, the overseas magazine, and Shokunin, the colonial review. Here are some of the examples of them. Works such as The Coffee Cake by author Otoa Saburo, published in the August 1932 issue of Kaigai, held out the promise of great wealth for intrepid young men and women. Again, Brazil was the most prominent of those destinations that the stories featured. So, while literature was not the primary focus of these journals, one could reliably find, from time to time, short stories that were published in the back pages extolling the success of immigrants. These stories were, ideologically speaking, often at arm's length from the pragmatic and at times sobering accounts of the realities immigrants faced on the ground. Although these journals often had articles from recent correspondents who had visited the lands they were writing about, and often included essays by immigrants who reflected on their lives abroad, usually in a positivistic sort of way. To my knowledge, none of the fiction that appeared in Japan in this popular literary genre was actually written by immigrants. Again, I say to the best of my knowledge. As such, they also stand at more than arm's length, more like transoceanic length, from the kinds of immigrant fiction that was being written largely by amateur immigrant authors and serialized in Japanese language newspapers and journals. I have in mind here Sao Paulo, but of course in Lima, in Los Angeles, anywhere where there was a sizable Japanese community. Now, there is one more category of immigrant literature that belongs in this conversation, which is so-called pure literature, Junbungaku in Japanese, or belles lettres. Insofar as it concerns Japanese immigration to Brazil, there is one text that stands above all others, Ishikawa Tatsuzō's novel Sobo, which I would translate as The Emigrants. So these are the sort of three streams converging into this category of Japanese Brazilian literature. Ishikawa's novel was awarded the first Akutagawa Prize for Literature in 1935. To this day, the Akutagawa Prize is still Japan's most prestigious literary award. It is a mixed blessing for scholars such as myself in this rather small subfield in which I work. On the one hand, the heightened visibility of this text means that everyone has heard of it, if not necessarily that everyone has read it. On the other, it is not representative of either of these other two predominantly popular forms of literary production. If my paper achieves nothing else today, I'm confident I can greatly complicate the received wisdom about Sobo and its author's role in establishing some categorical basis for immigrant literature and literature about Brazilian life in modern Japanese letters. Ultimately, this is a paper that is not about Sobo, but as per the title, which I didn't quite get to in my introduction, is about Ishikawa's representations of the city of Sao Paulo, his other writings on Sao Paulo. And so if I can ask your indulgence for what will seem like some interminable digressions, I will try to lay out what this means and what the difference is between Sobo and Ishikawa's other writings on Sao Paulo. So, originally written as a short story in 1934, Sobo portrayed a half-dozen Japanese immigrants from amongst the tens of thousands that were gathering annually at the National Immigration Center in Kobe from all over Japan, before departing for a new life on the coffee plantations and agricultural colonies in Brazil. Sobo achieved instant recognition and won the Ishikawa Prize in the following year, apparently in the attempt to establish some basis for this kind of literature. It was one of several such moves, more or less in unison with other acts of cultural diplomacy, that followed Japan's increasing isolation after the invasion of Manchuria. And indeed, these forms of cultural diplomacy sought to promote Japan's relationships with other parts of the world, especially in the global south. The original story, the one from 1934, ended with an immigrant steamer leaving the port of Kobe. The second and third chapters, which were only completed in 1939, were likewise primarily concerned with transoceanic passage. In fact, the second chapter of the story, which was called the South Seas Voyage, passed through that Nanyo or South Seas region that was very much a focus of Japanese expansionist efforts. So on the way to South America, they go through the South Seas. The global South is not just a contemporary construct, but was very much on the minds of expansionists in pre-war Japan. Okay. And so it's really only in the very last pages of the third chapter of the expanded novel that the immigrants finally reach Brazil. Only, to quote from the original, only to disappear like drops of water in a bucket as they are sent to their assigned destinations across the continental vastness of the country. In short, Sobo has little to say about the state of Sao Paulo and nothing to say about the city of Sao Paulo, whose population surged from 240,000 in 1900 to 579,000 in 1920 to 1.3 million by 1940, as it became both Brazil's industrial heartland and the heart of the global coffee trade. It has continued to grow unabated into the megacity of today, the largest in South America, with 11 million inhabitants in the capital and some 30 million in greater Sao Paulo. In such a short presentation as this, I can't hope to do justice to the complexity of the novel. For those of you who are interested in learning more about it, I highly recommend the recent article written by Professor Tachibana entitled Loss and Renewal in 3 Narratives of the Nikkei Diaspora, Ishikawa Tatsuzō's Sobo and its Sequels. Before proceeding further, I would like to register a frequent complaint that attended Sobo's reception in Brazil and continues to shape its legacy. And I'm somewhat following her article in expressing this, because she also talks about it at some length. This criticism primarily concerned the lack of subjective agency that Ishikawa attributes to the immigrants. In Ishikawa's account, they bitterly saw themselves as exiles, or in Japanese, kimi, who were forced to leave Japan out of sheer desperation. In the novel, the young man, Horiuchi, for instance, likens agricultural laborers in Japan to dead leaves. While they're alive and productive, the tree holds on to them. But once they dry up, they're gathered in places like the assembly center in Kobe to be swept away. And so Ishikawa was seen as denying the agency of the immigrants, and it appears in other ways as well. The third chapter of the novel is entitled A People Without a Voice, which instantly brings to mind Gayatri Spivak's seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? For those who are unaware of the extent to which amateur writers were engaged in producing their own colonial literature, as they called it, through the Japanese press based in Sao Paulo, this seems almost like bad faith on Ishikawa's part. Of course, he knew about this literary production because he visited Brazil and interacted with these people. As my dear colleague at Yale, John Treat, once quipped to me on this subject of the often overstated silencing of the subaltern, not only can the subaltern speak, sometimes the subaltern won't shut up. And so for those of you, and I'm happy to talk more about this later, but for those of you who have an occasion to see the incredible extent of the immigrant literature and the productivity of the Japanese press in the pre-war era in Brazil, to call them a people without a voice is certainly not accurate. But it is, after all, a novel. Now, for better or worse, in Sobo, Ishikawa sought to show how the working class were not masters of their own fate. In perhaps the most startling insight into the movements of global capital, the immigrants, I believe this is in the second chapter, witnessed the transport of goods at the port of Colombo in what was then Ceylon. So the immigrants have disembarked temporarily, and they're sort of watching all of the movement on the in the harbor. And the narrator describes as follows. The Indians, dusky-skinned and twice the size of Oizumi-san, with muscular shoulders, opened the hatch cover and began to unload bundles of Japanese cotton and hundreds of cotton fabrics. Japanese silk fabric was bound for Colombo. Ceylon black tea was bound for Cape Town. Brazilian coffee was bound for North America, and North American unprocessed cotton was bound for Japan. The global economy moved along with the La Plata Mar ship. In other words, global wealth undulated quickly. The immigrants observed this surprising economic movement without interest, as if it were from the moon. And so it's my own translation, I should say. So it's clear that the immigrants are interpolated into a marketplace that co-opts their participation and will no less efficiently exploit them, just as any other sundry commodity. Now, at this point, you might be saying to yourself, yes, this is all very true about Sobo, but didn't Ishikawa also write a travelogue in which he very clearly visited Sao Paulo, amongst a great many other places, and wrote about it? So if you were actually thinking this, you'd be right. Published in 1930, Ishikawa's Saikin Nande Oraiki, or Recent Travels in South America, goes into some detail about urban life and the sort of Japantown community based in Sao Paulo, what is now typically referred to by the name of the neighborhood, Liberdade, meaning simply liberty. So Ishikawa wrote his travelogue when he visited Brazil firsthand, and the novel Sobo came later. In the staccato prose so many modernist writers of the era adopt when listing up the marvels of a modern city, Ishikawa writes about Sao Paulo. It's a city. There is human movement. It moves in unison with the world. There are radio broadcasts. The fashions are ever-changing. It is visited by Zeppelin airships. There's a 43-story tall skyscraper, a flood of automobiles. It moves to jazz and cinema. Love is always in the air. Sao Paulo. This is a city whose population is 1.1 million. Ishikawa had more to say about Sao Paulo than broad encomium. He describes how the Japanese salarymen he met there, to a man, had no intention of ever going back to the struggles they faced in Japan. Did they have no patriotic spirit, he wondered? And then self-reflexively responds, yes, they had plenty of it. That's precisely why the words were so bitter to say out loud. It was the same as for a man betrayed by his lover. So here too we see the representation of the immigrants on Ishikawa's part as feeling quite bitter that they had had to leave Japan under less than ideal circumstances. But lest I get too carried away talking about Ishikawa's travelogue, let me offer another spoiler alert that this is also not the main subject of this presentation. I have something else coming. But again, I would be remiss not to mention, if only in passing, Ishikawa's keen interest in Sao Paulo in this earliest of his writings about Brazil from 1930. He devoted 10 of the book's 56 short chapters to Sao Paulo, observing its nightlife, strolling its streets, dwelling on the future of Brazilian industry and the coffee trade, which was then in a slump, as well as the new forms of cultural encounters between the Japanese and those of European background, made possible by this most cosmopolitan of South American cities and most welcoming of Japanese immigrants. And yet he reiterates, when he writes about Sao Paulo for the third and final time, a lament that opens the book. Namely, that being so very unlike other nations and peoples, quote, Japan was an orphan in the world, end quote. Time and again I've come to this passage, and it always strikes me anew as incredibly poignant and paradoxical. At the height of the Japanese Empire and the surging expansionism via trade and immigration that had brought Japan into the world as never before, Ishikawa felt a profound sense of Japan's isolation, if not alienation. So what are we to make of this? Tentatively, we might say that the same forces of imperialism, capitalism, and internationalism that opened up Japan to global trade since the 1850s had also exposed fissures in social and cultural belonging. For Ishikawa and his Japanese compatriots in Brazil, it was possible to be not quite at home in several places in the world, to experience a simultaneous loss of identity between homeland and adopted land, or between homeland and the in-betweenness of a new cosmopolitanism. This is at least in part what I have in mind when I invoke in my current research a concept such as transnational subjectivity, the dislocation that comes with being caught between two or more national forms of identity that make conflicting demands upon us, and is not always easily resolved. So to come to sort of the thrust of my paper, and again I apologize for the endless digressions, for the longest time, as John said, for about a decade, since I began even to imagine a project on the Japanese in Brazil, I was under the mistaken impression that Sobo and the recent travels in South America travelogue were the only texts Ishikawa had written about Brazil, or for that matter, about Sao Paulo. I too might be forgiven for believing this, considering that none of the existing secondary scholarship on the subject would ever lead you to think otherwise, lead me to think otherwise. So it was only in July, less than 3 months ago, that I came across 3 short stories written by Ishikawa, 2 from 1938 that offer dramatically different variations on the theme of Japanese immigration, and 1 from 1935 called Seishi Gika, or as I'll freely translate here, Sao Paulo Nocturne. I did not find these stories in the collected works of Ishikawa, although they are in there, sort of hiding in plain sight. Rather, I found this Sao Paulo Nocturne in an old beat-up post-war reproduction of Sobo gathering dust in the library basement at Waseda University. What set me looking for it, let me turn the page here because this is the breakdown. This is the table of contents in Japanese and its translation, as well as the other 2 works, one of which, the very last one I'll get to in a moment. What set me looking for this story was another discovery, namely that Ishikawa had serialized a work with the nearly identical title, but now not Seishi. By the way, Seishi, which means sort of like holy city, was a logographic abbreviation, still sometimes used today in the Japanese community to refer to Sao Paulo. Right? So instead of Seishi Gika, Ishikawa had published a nearly identical story with the title San Paulo no Gika, okay, so sort of, again, Sao Paulo Nocturne, in the journal Shokunin, and it appeared across 5 issues spread out from January to July 1933. So when you take these as a whole, and we look at the dates, it extends backward prior to Sobo, the origins of this story, Sao Paulo Nocturne, 1933 rather than 55, and fills in another gap between Sobo and the recent travels in South America. So instead of thinking about Ishikawa as an author who wrote 3 sporadic works on Brazil, each at a remove of 3 to 4 years, in other words, the travelogue, then the first chapter of Sobo, then the last 2 chapters, here was proof that he'd been consistently writing about Brazil for the entire decade, roughly 1929 to 1939. And I want to caution that there may be other texts about Brazil in his collected works that have yet to be identified by scholars. So you can invite me back in a year and I'll let you know what I found. But there was another surprise in store. I nearly did a spit take in the preparation for this talk when I realized that 5-part work serialized in the journal Shokunin was almost completely different from the one in the book. I read the one in the book first. It was easier to read as a paper copy instead of my photographs. As it turned out, the Shokunin version was not a single narrative at all, but a collection of 9 unrelated sketches of varying length in which only the first two bore any relation to the story Ishikawa later published in 1935 under the nearly identical title. Now, where? I don't know yet. The book that it appears in, the one that you have the table of contents from, was published in 1947. And it gives the 35 date, I think Showa Junen, I can't see from far angle, but it doesn't say where. So that remains a mystery to me. Unlike the later work, the version in Shokumin has sketches that concern all aspects of Japanese life in Brazil, from the immigrants' arrival in Santos to daily life in the Japanese neighborhood of Liberdade. Even one sketch that involves a scheme to adopt a kana-only newspaper in the Japanese community. As a scholar of sort of Japanese language and script reform, I read that one with particular interest. And there's also another sketch on the attractions of the red light district in Ipiranga. Bits and pieces of these sketches, such as the part about the kana newspaper, were clearly reworked in the story called The Sketch of Paradise. And incidentally, we also have some precedent for this in Ishikawa's Sobo. He took the opening lines for the novel from his travel log. So it wasn't the first time that he sort of reworked some of his earlier material. Okay. By contrast, the story, which I'm going to talk about from here to the end of my talk, from the 1935 version of Sao Paulo Nocturne, has no Japanese characters or any references to Japan whatsoever. I'm almost inclined to call it an act of brilliant literary impersonation, as Ishikawa returned to Sao Paulo for a story that, but for the inescapable fact that it is written in Japanese, features no Japanese characters or references to Japan, and faithfully corresponds in nearly every narratological sense to the definition of the conto, or modern Brazilian short story. How is this possible? Did Ishikawa spend any significant amount of time learning Portuguese? No. Was he especially well-versed in Brazilian literature? Also no. And what did the author, who had previously written that Japan was an orphan in the world, possibly have in mind to write a kind of love letter to Sao Paulo in which there wasn't so much as a single Japanese reference? At the very least, we are confronted by a very different trilogy of texts here than the 3 chapters of Sobo that have until now been the fulcrum of research for scholars in modern Japanese literature about Brazil in that belletristic register. So, Sao Paulo Nocturne, I'm just going to give a very brief sketch of the plot, but Sao Paulo Nocturne opens with a description of, quote, that city of extravagance, city of love, and yes, city of coffee, whose night skies are illuminated by the Southern Cross, while the breeze carries notes of northern civilization and reckless desire. End quote. At dusk, under the glow of neon lights, the dandy and poet Albion catches a glimpse of the beautiful Italian immigrant shopgirl Teresa through the shop window of a tie store on Rua Salvento. This is the environs of the Japanese neighborhood. In fact, I put it on the first slide of my paper, so let me go back to it. Again, none of the Japanese restaurants or inns or shops that Ishikawa had talked about in one of the sketches from the Shokumin version appear in this story. But anyone who saw the title, the name Rua Salvento would know that this was the same neighborhood. So, in the 1935 version, as in the sketch, Teresa is terribly myopic, and while depicted as unattractive in the original sketch, in the short story, she is now called a beauty, or Bijin. This is the Shokumin version. She's called a beauty, and her squint is described as reminiscent of Tolstoy's character Katusha Maslova, played by Dolores Del Rio in the 1927 film Resurrection. You can see her on the right. The poet who dreams of winning the lottery is also based off the Lotteria sketch in Shokumin. I'm just going to go back to that for a moment. And you can see it on the far left. It's actually, roteria is written in hiragana. But now the character who appeared in the sketch is this poet who has the added motivation for winning Teresa's heart. As always happens in such matters, there's a love triangle. She is already engaged to another man, the mild-mannered tailor Geraldo, whose limp was caused by fighting in the Constitutionalist Revolution of 1932, also known as the Brazilian Civil War, which took place the year before. And I put a little dramatis persona here for you. As you can see, Albion is not very good at picking the numbers for his lottery tickets. And again, Geraldo, the third character in this love triangle, is a veteran of Brazil's Civil War, also known as the Constitutionalist Rebellion, in which the Sao Paulo coffee plantation class rose up against the coup d'etat of Getúlio Vargas unsuccessfully. And so Geraldo is injured and has a permanently lame leg that causes him no small source of shame and discomfort. So, in the Shokumin version of the story, we simply have Teresa, the shop girl, lamenting the loss of vigor in her boyfriend, in her fiancé. And the historical focus is even more overtly registered. She laments that her boyfriend survived the 1924 Paulista revolt unscathed when he was only 18, but then he was injured. Going back to the 1935 version, Geraldo prefers to walk at night and in the shadows so others won't see his disability. And indeed, he's constantly worried that Teresa will leave him, and not without reason, because she's almost completely seduced by this poet. At any rate, Sao Paulo Nocturne is, again, to the best of my ability, the first work of modern Japanese literature to address this pivotal event in the history of modern Brazil, the uprising in the state of Sao Paulo against the coup d'etat of Getúlio Vargas. I know of only one other work that makes reference to it in the immigrant literature produced in Brazil, author Sugi Takeo's story Café en Ouro, or Selling the Coffee Plantation, published in 1932 by the Brasileiro newspaper in Sao Paulo. And I've written about that elsewhere, so I'm happy to answer questions about it as well. In Sao Paulo Nocturne, the setting of urban Sao Paulo is almost a character in its own right. And I want to call it a kind of modernist inflected description, again, of neon-lit street life, of parks, cafes, and sorbet stands. Where the original sketch somewhat overplays its hand of love being in the air as characteristic of the sultry climate and of hot-blooded Brazilians, now the city is this idea of love in the air is suffused into jazz, film, and the fantasy of modern life in the cosmopolitan city. While Albion courts Teresa on arc lamp-lit high streets, Geraldo lurks in the shadows of the parks, and goes on a solitary walk to the red light district in Ipiranga. So again, this picks up one of the other sketches, and in both, the word written in katakana, white slavery, is given to talk about prostitution. Geraldo fears Teresa will abandon him and is suffering both psychologically and physically from the injury to his leg. During this solitary walk, he encounters first an Italian prostitute and then a cabocla, or mixed-race woman, identified in Portuguese and English first as moça da cidade and then its translation street girl. Although he rejects both their offers for sexual services, the fact that his leg is not abhorrent to them gives him some hope, some cause for hope, that Teresa will also see past his injury and come to accept him again. So I'm hurrying very quickly through the plot, but needless to say, Albion does not win the lottery with 7777 or 8888, and his plans to whisk Teresa away on a romantic whirlwind trip to Rio de Janeiro never comes to fruition. She confronts him but now even more broke than the day they met. He snubs her, his pretense of being a playboy well and over. She rushes back to Geraldo, who is none the wiser, and presses him to marry her. When he agrees to do so, she cries tears of relief and happiness to have his love. So therein is the structure of the plot. Now, akin to the Brazilian conto, São Paulo Nocturne is pared down to the essentials: a small cast of characters, a linear narrative propelled by frequent dialogue and/or asides that directly or indirectly address the reader. Also true to the conto, some outside force disturbs the status quo, and while this disequilibrium will be resolved such that there is an appearance of identicality, things never quite return the same as they were before. In my haste to provide this barest of plot outlines, I haven't been able to do justice to the narrative light touch that Ishikawa employs, which captures not only the seductive force between the characters, but also of the city as a place of seemingly endless possibilities and encounters. Moreover, in its accurate description of downtown localities and frequent Portuguese glossing, the reader is transported a world away to the Paulista capital. Indeed, right there on the Rua São Bento, that lay just on the doorstep of the unseen, unrepresented, now unrepresented Japanese immigrants. So, to kind of recap from the top, when we survey the three spheres of literary production about Japanese Brazilian immigrant literature in the pre-war era, there emerges a kind of Venn diagram. I'll go back to my previous slide. Since 1908, when Japanese immigrants brought with them the habitus of the Japanese press, aboard the steamers that were taking them abroad, newspapers that published poetry and prose established what was less the imagined community of the homeland than that of the transnational immigrant community itself. So they started on the ship, 50-day voyage, and when they arrived in Brazil, they continued to write and publish and represent themselves to themselves. Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, pro-expansionist journals, and later the literary establishment, sought to promote the heroic mission of immigrants going abroad and striking it rich. I said a moment ago, a kind of Venn diagram, for if there is anything that overlaps, it is the concept of immigrant literature, but not the works or authors themselves. To the best of my knowledge, like the fourth time I'm saying this, but I'm hedging my best, no pre-war works published in Brazil were republished in Japan or vice versa, nor were works clearly designated as popular literature or by amateur writers at any time accepted into the rarefied world of the literary establishment. So in this sense, they were largely distinct spheres of literary production and activity. So where do we find Ishikawa in all of this? Excavating Ishikawa's other works from this period, not only with its further elaboration of the Japanese immigrant experience in Brazil in the two stories, A Sketch of Paradise and Separation, but in its diversification away from the crucible of the immigrant voyage alone, and in its lingering fascination with Sao Paulo, suggest alternatives to the bitter lament that Japan is an orphan in the world. Sao Paulo Nocturne raises its own share of questions about what constitutes the limits of modern Japanese and modern Brazilian literature. Is it adequate to ascribe a particular work to the national canon solely based on the language used or the place where it was written? Or for that matter, the nationality of the author or his readers? Let's say we don't want to take Ishikawa as modern Brazilian literature. He was a Japanese author. He lived in Japan. He only visited Brazil. Fair enough, perhaps. But if not this work, what about the dozens written in Brazil by first-generation Japanese immigrants such as Sugi Takeo, who made their whole lives in Brazil, but wrote in Japanese? And why should one be more fittingly Japanese or Brazilian than the other? Ultimately, these may be questions of little importance when the works lie forgotten, buried under the dust of neglect and obliterated imperial past. But it needn't always be this way. It is my hope that this project I'm undertaking will bring these texts into a second life of readership and critical response, illuminating the past and restoring a sense of deeper shared history and literature that negotiated between the two nations. Thank you.
We have plenty of time to.
Oh, I should have kept talking. Happy to take questions, big or small.
So you think in the 1930s, in Japanese is going to put any author, and certainly Ishikawa, Tatsuzō, sort of squarely in the eyes of censorship and things like that. So I'm kind of interested in what types of collections he was picked up by, whether he was ever pressed in the 1940s to do literature that would have been supportive of the Japanese imperial expansion, and then how his time in Sao Paulo was recruited.
Sure, there's a lot of questions there. I'll try to answer the ones I know best. There was, of course, questions of censorship with respect to Soul Reiko's article and my own work both cite the Japanese scholar whose name is eluding me for the moment. The original publication, so the first version of Soul when it was written as a short story, had some passages that were stricken. I don't remember if they used the Fuseiji, the censorship marks that John has written so much about, but one of the immigrants breathes a deep sigh of relief upon quitting Japan, and so that was seen as inappropriate. In other words, if it was the heroic duty of immigrants to leave Japan, it was. They weren't supposed to be happy about it. Right? This bitterness was, in a certain sense, the appropriate sobriety, somberness to accompany leaving Japan. And in fact, in the travelogue, when Ishikawa describes his own experience of leaving Japan, knowing full well that he was going to come back, he wrote in English, "Farewell, my homeland." So it's in the middle of the Japanese text, there's this English line, "Farewell, my homeland." It's not clear exactly who he was writing this for. Maybe it was a reference to some famous literary text that I'm just not aware of. But at any rate, as I said before, the awarding of the Akutagawa Prize to this novel really established it on a very different footing. And I want to argue, although one can parse, as Reiko has done very thoroughly, one can parse the comments of the Japanese writers who were on the prize committee and why they selected it, but I see it very clearly as one of many acts of cultural diplomacy that was trying to domestically, internally promote this notion of Japanese immigration to Brazil. For one thing, up until actually 1936, there was something like 25,000 Japanese making this 50-day voyage around the world per year. In 1936, a constitutional amendment that passed in Brazil that really throttled the immigration brought that number from about 25,000, really an unlimited number, but roughly 25,000, to something like a cap of about 4,000 a year. So from 1936 to 1941, you still have significant numbers, about 4,000 a year, but not the huge numbers that were coming. So I did a kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation, and in addition to the 189,000 Japanese immigrants who came to Brazil before 1941, you would have had about another 175,000 if the numbers had continued unabated. Even after it happened, there was still a huge Japanese community and a growing community in Brazil that was very much engaged in this valuable trade. Again, that quote from Ishikawa's travelogue where he talks about the destinations, the circulation of these different commodities, each one played its role. And indeed, the Japanese labor that was producing coffee to go back home as well, but to buy cotton from the Americans so that they weren't under the thumb of the British monopoly, was very important to the Japanese Empire. Okay, so there are those questions. Faye Kleeman's book, she talks at length about Ishikawa being, I don't want to say conscripted, but certainly brought on board these sort of writers' committees that were sent to places like Taiwan and Northeast Asia, and were called upon to sort of serve as mentors to colonial literature in a very different register than what I've just been describing, and of course to try to help Japanese colonial subjects become more like us, become more like imperial citizens. Okay. So that's also part of the picture. As far as your question, which collections, the text was published in, I don't have that information off the top of my head, but it certainly has been widely reproduced. I also would add that in 2008, in time for the centenary commemoration of the Japanese immigration to Brazil, a Portuguese translation of Sobo was made. So there still isn't an English translation. If I ever have like a spare year of my life, which I don't think I will, I'll try to do one myself, but I'm very happy if someone else comes along and beats me to it. But there is a Portuguese translation for those of you who read Portuguese. I'm happy to make my copy available if anyone is interested. Yes, Sarah?
Thank you so much. That was really important. I was wondering, because you brought up the 1939 Constitutional Revolution, if you could say a little bit more about what the perspective was on that, either from Ishikawa or other writers. And if they're also, because of course, right, this is a sort of pivotal moment in Brazil as well, as in so many places in the world, where this country that has had these very strong regional identities and not been, not had a particularly strong central powers, sort of coming under this move to centralize the government. And so I was wondering also if there's, so what the perspective was on that, and if there was any kind of, I guess, global consciousness in that sense that what's happening in Brazil is also connected to the reasons that are leading Japan.
Sure. So it's a very good question that has probably a much longer answer than I'll have time to give, but I'll try to sketch out a few things. Japan itself was entering into this period that we've come to call the period of government by assassination. And so the imperialist cadres that were increasingly sort of taking control, not only of the military, but also of the direction of the country, were, especially after the Manchurian incident, were increasingly putting Japan on this footing towards total war. And so you see, even in the cover of Shokumin, that it says, a little hard to read here, but it says, Hijoji Nihon Kaigai Choshingo. So it's like special issue for the overseas march or overseas advance during national emergency, Japan's state of emergency. These state of emergencies were happening increasingly frequently. And even in the press in Brazil, you would have special issues that would flash, Prime Minister so-and-so assassinated and things like that. So it's not clear where the Japanese were supposed to go, right? If you emigrated to Brazil and now there was a coup d'etat and dictatorship, it wasn't necessarily clear that Brazil was preferable to Japan in the sense of governmental stability. But certainly the Japanese immigrants were collateral damage, as it were, between the president, Vargas, and the coffee plantation owners who were resisting him. So in the author Sugi Takeo's story, Selling the Coffee Plantation, which was published in the same year as the Constitutionalist Revolution, we see a Japanese family being preyed upon by the soldiers. They steal first stirrups, then they steal the horse itself, and they're stealing pinga or aguardiente from the farm. And ultimately, this Japanese family, which had come a few years earlier to try to set up its own coffee farm, ended up losing their livelihood. They wind up having to sell their property with its immature trees that never reached maturity. And so one also sees in journals like Shokumin these articles from 1932 on that are keeping track of political and economic instability. Another story that I talk about in my book manuscript is that when Ishikawa arrived to Brazil in 1929, the price of coffee had plunged because of oversupply, as well as, obviously the Great Depression affecting prices. Brazil wound up dumping tons of coffee into the sea and also using coffee as fuel pellets to use up this extra supply. It's kind of shocking, I remember when I first read this, and I was thinking, here are these people going 50 days by sea. They're arriving in a foreign land and they're doing manual labor, farm labor, and they make all this coffee. Not just Japanese, but immigrants from Italy and Central Europe and so forth. And all this coffee was then going to get dumped in the ocean. Think about all the wasted effort, the wasted labor. But these kind of economic and political problems were quite common in the late 20s, 30s, and 40s. So in that sense, again, it's not clear where people could have gone or what they were supposed to do to avoid instability. Ultimately, though, immigrants kept pouring into Brazil, and part of the reason there is simply the availability of land and the availability of opportunity. Certain ideologues in Japan, for instance, Tsurumi Yusuke, the father of Tsurumi Shunsuke, wrote in his book Expansionist Japan, I think it's also from 1935. No, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of another work that he wrote. He wrote a book called Expansionist Japan, but I believe it's in another book that he wrote that was in English. And he said, there's no such thing as surplus population. If a country doesn't want our immigrants, as was the case with the United States, we will simply not send them to that country. We don't want to go where we're not wanted, which is ironic given the way the Japanese Empire went where it wasn't wanted. But at any rate, that notion of surplus population was really no joke, despite what ideologues might say to the contrary. So people who had no opportunities, no land to work or to inherit, were very highly motivated to leave Japan and try their fortune somewhere else. And so ultimately, I think that alone was a highly compelling, motivating factor for why people would continue to come to Brazil, even when really, if they were not just reading the sort of ideological literature at the back of these journals, if they were reading the articles about the price of coffee, the oversupply of coffee, political instability, and what have you, they would know that they were heading into headwinds, and yet they chose to do it, perhaps because it was still the best possible opportunity. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, the people who are going to Brazil have been the kind of people who are reading a journal like that?
It's not clear to me how many of them necessarily were reading these journals, but because not everyone was necessarily highly educated, not necessarily able to get their hands on journals that were produced in Tokyo. Certainly the people who were writing the journals were state planners, ideologues. As we see from the advertisements, there were big banks, and agribusiness was behind this. Certainly the articles were not written for a sort of grade school educated farmer. The stories were also not written necessarily for for someone who had like a middle school education, but they were popular literature, and so they have the kind of narrative structure, simplified narrative structure, and clear messaging that was very much in line with the purpose of these journals. I don't think Shokumin or Kaigai, I'll just go back to the other covers, I don't think that they could afford to lie to their to their readers and say things were good when they weren't. But by the way, they were they were sort of bullish on the long run, the long-term outlook. Establishing a Japanese presence in the world, from their perspective, was a positive, an absolutely positive good in the long run. But it doesn't mean that the farmers were necessarily accessing these journals and sort of buying into that, like, scene from on high. What I can tell you is this. You see in these journals, for instance, advertisements for language schools at places like, I don't know, Sophia University. You could study Spanish and Portuguese. And so my sense is that the upper echelon of perhaps 10%, 15%, whatever it was, who were going to be the bank managers, the doctors and dentists and other thin layer of white-collar workers and bureaucracy, people who worked in the consulate. Those were the people who were definitely reading these journals. And indeed, the journals, although, as I said, there doesn't appear to be overlap in the literature, we see articles that talk about the different immigrant newspapers. Who was the editor? I learned that one editor for the Brasil Jiho came from San Francisco. He was plucked from his position to take up this new role. So we do get that kind of information. But obviously not everyone in this roughly 200,000 strong community was going to be engaged in this kind of higher level of discourse. Doesn't mean they didn't read the newspaper in Brazil, though. After all, that would be your only point of contact with Japanese literacy and what was happening in the world. And even if you didn't care about literature, you didn't care about who that Mussolini guy was or whatever, you still wanted to know what the price of coffee beans were because you didn't want to sell them at the wrong time. That's where you read the newspaper for that kind of information too. So yeah, we have to think about these sometimes overlapping, sometimes not overlapping spheres of influence. And that's something I'm still sort of figuring out for the book. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.